My name is Carol Bennett. I'm 63 years old, a widow living quietly in Seattle. For most of my life, I've been the kind of person who believes in family above all else. That's why, on my son Ryan's birthday, I thought it would be sweet to surprise him. I baked his favorite cake, tucked it carefully in a box, and decided to wait for him in his car so I could jump out with a big smile when he came home. It felt playful, almost childlike, as I hid there holding my breath, clutching the cake like it was a piece of my heart. But instead of laughter, what I heard made my blood run cold. A conversation that wasn't meant for me slipped through the silence words of betrayal. Sharp and undeniable. In that cramped space, I felt my world tilt in a way I never expected. And that was just the beginning. Would you like to hear what happened next? I can still remember the smell of that cake filling the car. Larkin's Bakery always had the richest chocolate, and I had asked them to add the ganache Ryan loved as a boy. I carried it so carefully, like it wasn't just sugar and flour, but a piece of love I had baked into every layer. Sitting there in the driver's seat of his car, I felt almost giddy. My hands trembled with excitement, not fear. I thought of his face lighting up, the way he'd laugh when I shouted surprise. For a moment, I felt young again, a mother waiting to delight her child. The car was quiet, the leather seats holding a faint chill. I pressed myself down, clutching the bakery box. Every sound outside made my heart leap footsteps, doors closing, voices drifting past. Finally, I heard the familiar rhythm of Ryan's stride. My pulse quickened. This was it. He opened the door, slid into the seat, and the car shifted with his weight. My breath caught as I bit down a smile. But then, before I could reveal myself, the other door opened. Brooke, his business partner. I froze, my joy tangled with confusion. Why was she here now? Their voices began, casual at first, but something in the tone shifted the air. The warmth I had carried into that car began to drain away, replaced by a knot in my stomach. I leaned in, straining to listen. What I heard next changed everything. The door shut, and for a moment it was just the three of us them in the front, me holding my breath in the back, with the cake trembling in my lap. I thought I would burst out laughing, surprise them. But then Ryan's voice dropped low, and the words carved into me like glass. He was talking about papers, about how after Thomas died, he had slipped in to change things, my house deed, the beneficiary accounts, even the power of attorney I had signed without a second thought. My son, my boy, the one I had trusted with every corner of my life. I wanted to believe I had misheard, but Brooke's tone left no room for hope. She called me a liability, something to manage, not a mother, not a person. Cold, sharp, like she was talking about weeds in a garden that needed pulling. As they spoke, my mind betrayed me with images of Ryan as a child, sticky fingers reaching for birthday candles. That mischievous grin when he thought he'd gotten away with stealing a cookie. I remembered how he'd cried when he scraped his knee, and how he once clung to me, swearing he'd never let me be alone. Those memories clashed with the man in front of me now, plotting my erasure with the woman beside him. The cake box grew heavy in my arms, no longer sweet but bitter, a symbol of a celebration that would never happen. My hands shook, but I didn't make a sound. When they finally left, I slipped out the opposite door like a shadow. My heart shattered, my trust gone. I walked away quietly, clutching that cake, already feeling the weight of questions I wasn't ready to face. I remember walking back into my house that night, closing the door as softly as I could, as if silence might somehow protect me. The lights felt too bright, so I left them off. I set the cake on the counter, untouched, and stood there in the quiet, wondering how everything I thought I knew had unraveled in a single evening. My mind reached for the safer places first, the image of Ryan at 5 years old, running barefoot across the lawn, clutching a kite that was far too big for him. The way he'd crawl into my lap after nightmares, whispering that I made him feel safe. I held those moments close, because they reminded me of the boy I had loved so fiercely. The boy I believed was still somewhere inside the man I saw today. But as the stillness wrapped around me, other memories pushed their way in. Papers he hurried me to sign after Thomas's funeral, saying it was all routine. The way he'd brush off my questions with practiced ease. Brooke's cool politeness. Her eyes always scanning past me, like I was a placeholder in a world she didn't think I belonged in. I had felt those tugs of doubt before, but I smoothed them over with trust. Maybe I wanted so badly to believe I wasn't alone that I ignored the warning signs. Sitting in that kitchen, I felt the ache of regret, but also the faint stir of something else. Awareness. A shift. If I had missed the signs before, I couldn't afford to miss them again. The pieces were there, waiting to be uncovered, and for the first time since Thomas died, I felt a small spark inside me, not just grief, but the beginning of resolve. The next morning, before the sun had fully lifted over Seattle, I knew I couldn't sit idle anymore. Reflection had given me pain. Yes, but also direction. If what I overheard in that car was real, I needed proof. My first stop was Larkin's Bakery, the little place where I had ordered Ryan's favorite chocolate cake since he was a boy. The smell of sugar and cocoa wrapped around me the moment I walked in, and for a second, I almost let myself feel comforted. But then I saw a sketchbook open on the counter, pages filled with designs for a tiered wedding cake. The baker, without thinking, mentioned Ryan and Brooke had been in last week, planning flavors and colors. My heart sank. A wedding? Plans made without me. That cake, the same bakery I thought connected us, had already been claimed for a future I wasn't invited to. I left with a smile plastered on my face, but inside, something fractured. By the time I reached the bank, the sweetness of the bakery had curdled into suspicion. Denise, the manager, knew me from years of routine visits. She hesitated when I asked about my accounts, but after a pause, she showed me the files. My name wasn't first anymore. Ryan had been listed as primary. I had been pushed to secondary, quietly shifted aside. Beneficiary changes had been made right after Thomas's death. Then came the numbers. Withdrawals, massive ones totaling about $2,000. My breath caught. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't oversight. This was deliberate. Walking out of that bank, the world felt colder, sharper. It was no longer just about being left out of a birthday or a wedding. This was theft. This was betrayal dressed as love. And in that moment, I understood they hadn't just broken my heart. They were dismantling my life, and I wasn't going to let them. I spread the papers across my kitchen table, the same table where Thomas and I used to drink coffee every morning. But instead of comfort, I saw lines of ink that cut deeper than any knife. The bank account was just the beginning. The house deed our home that Thomas and I built together had been altered. Ryan's name had quietly slid into place. Mine pushed to the side. Thomas's life insurance, the one policy he set up so I'd never have to worry, now listed Ryan as the sole beneficiary. Every safety net that should have caught me after Thomas's death had been rewoven to catch him instead. I thought back to those weeks after the funeral. I barely remember eating, barely remember sleeping. I was drowning in grief, and Ryan had shown up with stacks of papers. He told me it was all routine things that needed signatures to keep things moving. I signed them blindly, my hands trembling, tears staining the ink. I thought my son was protecting me. In reality, he was stripping me of everything Thomas left behind. The realization burned through me. None of this was an accident. It wasn't sloppy banking or miscommunication. It was orchestrated, calculated, done by the very person I trusted most. The boy I once held against my chest, whose scraped knees I kissed, had sat across from me with a pen and turned my grief into his opportunity. The sorrow was crushing, but beneath it, something else stirred. A low, simmering anger. This wasn't just betrayal, it was abuse. Financial abuse, deliberate and cruel. He hadn't just broken my heart, he had tried to erase my future. I sat there staring at the documents, my hands no longer shaking. For the first time in weeks, my tears stopped. If Ryan thought I would let this go quietly, he didn't know me at all. It was time to fight back. I reached a point where the silence was heavier than the betrayal itself. I couldn't carry it alone anymore. One afternoon, I sat across from my closest friend, hands trembling as I finally let the words spill out. I told her everything: the car, the bakery, the bank papers, the realization that Ryan had turned my grief into his gain. Saying it out loud felt like peeling off a mask I'd been suffocating under. She didn't judge me. She didn't try to downplay it. She listened. And then she told me I didn't have to face this alone. She urged me to seek real help, the kind that could look at these papers and see them for what they were. So I did. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I felt both terrified and strangely lighter. He laid out the documents across his desk, scanning them with a practiced eye. When he looked back at me, his words confirmed what my heart already knew. This wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated fraud. Maybe even a crime. The power of attorney, the deed, the insurance. All of it pointed to deliberate financial abuse. For a moment, I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. But instead, something steadier took hold. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt the faintest pulse of strength. My world had been shattered. Yes, but I wasn't powerless. I walked out of that office knowing one thing: I was done being silent. The fight was just beginning. Marcus started showing up more often, lingering in the kitchen or hovering in the living room with that easy smile of his. On the surface, it looked like casual friendliness, but I could feel the weight of his eyes studying me. He was checking for cracks, for signs that I knew too much. I forced myself into a role I never imagined I'd play: the harmless widow. A little scatterbrained, grateful for the company. I offered him tea, asked about football games, pretended not to notice the way he slipped Ryan's name into every other sentence. Inside, my stomach knotted with fear. If he suspected that I'd been listening, everything could unravel. There were moments when I almost faltered. A too long pause. A flicker of anger in my voice. But I smoothed it over with a laugh or a story about Thomas. Each time, I saw his suspicion ease, just enough for me to breathe again. But while he thought he was testing me, I was quietly testing him. I caught fragments, mentions of accounts, the word cover, hints that Brooke was pulling strings behind the scenes. I pieced them together like broken glass, sharp and dangerous, but forming a picture I couldn't ignore. Living under the same roof with those who saw me as an obstacle was like walking a tightrope over fire. Yet their underestimation became my shield. Playing dumb bought me time. And in that time, I gathered something more valuable than comfort leverage. I knew then what had to come next. If words could slip so easily in my kitchen, then maybe, just maybe, I could capture proof strong enough to break everything wide open. I had never done anything so bold in my life. My hands trembled as I slipped my phone beneath a stack of folded dish towels on the counter, the tiny red light hidden from view. I told myself to breathe, to look frail, to act confused, because that was the mask they expected me to wear. Ryan came first, all swagger and careless charm, and Brooke followed, cool as glass. I let my shoulders sag, let my voice quiver, asking small questions that made me sound naive. They thought I was fishing for reassurance, when in truth, I was luring them closer to the truth I needed. It didn't take long. Ryan puffed up with pride, almost enjoying the sound of his own voice as he laid it out the way he had changed the papers after Thomas's death, how he redirected accounts and secured control over the deed. My stomach turned, but I held my expression steady, nodding as though I didn't quite understand. Then Brooke, sharp and dismissive, cut in. She laughed about how easy it had been, how grief had blinded me, how I had signed everything without question. She spoke of me as though I weren't even in the room, mocking my trust, mocking my love. Every word seared into me, but behind the sting was a growing fire. The recorder was catching it all, their arrogance, their cruelty, their confession. When they left the room, I retrieved the phone with shaking hands. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. But this time, it wasn't only fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, I held something solid in my grasp. Proof. I pressed the phone to my chest, whispering to myself that I wasn't powerless anymore. The storm was coming, but now I was ready to fight. Vanessa showed up at my door in the middle of the afternoon, her smile too sharp, her tone dripping with false sweetness. She didn't need to say much for me to understand. Every word was coded in warning. She hinted that I ought to stay quiet, that stirring things up would only bring trouble I wasn't prepared for. The way her eyes lingered on me, steady and cold, made my skin crawl. I kept my face calm, nodded politely, and closed the door as soon as she left. But inside, I was trembling. They knew. They suspected. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. Then I heard it, a faint rattle at the back door, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shifting in the window frame. My chest tightened. I grabbed the small recorder from my nightstand and held it like a lifeline, crouching in the dark corner of my room, hardly daring to breathe. Footsteps scraped against the porch. The doorknob jiggled. My heart pounded so loud, I was sure they could hear it from outside. I whispered silent prayers, clutching the proof I had risked everything to capture. And then red and blue lights cut through the night. Sirens pierced the silence. The intruders scattered, their retreat lost in the chaos of police arrival. I stayed hidden until the officers called my name, their voices steady, reassuring. Relief flooded me, but it was jagged, not soft. The message had been delivered loud and clear. They were willing to intimidate me, maybe even hurt me. But as I stood there, shaken yet unbroken, I felt a strange steadiness take hold. They wanted me to be afraid, and I was. But fear was no longer enough to stop me. The fight had crossed a new line, and I knew the next step was inevitable. Justice had to begin. The night of the attempted break-in still hung heavy in the air when the officers sat me down at my kitchen table. My hands shook as I pulled the small recorder from my pocket, setting it between us like a fragile piece of my heart. For weeks I had carried it, terrified it might be discovered. Now, at last, I was handing over the proof of everything I had endured. They listened, their faces tightening as Ryan's voice spilled out, boasting about forged documents, stolen money, and the way he had used my grief as a shield. Brooke's mocking words cut just as sharply through the recording, and Vanessa's cold dismissal sealed it. I watched the officers exchange glances, and for the first time, I felt something shift. I was being believed. Within days, I heard the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Marcus, Vanessa, Brooke, each of them taken into custody. I wasn't there for Ryan, but I didn't need to be. Just knowing the law was finally on my side was enough. The weight pressing down on my chest for months began to lift, replaced by a strange quiet inside me. It wasn't joy exactly. It was relief, threaded with grief. My own son had betrayed me, and no amount of justice could undo that wound. But as I stood on my porch, watching the squad cars pull away, I realized I was no longer powerless. My voice, my truth, had finally broken through the lies. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of justice. And though my heart was scarred, I knew I was ready to step into whatever came next. The fight had brought me to this point, but healing, somehow, had to follow. The day the judge read the verdict, I felt my knees weaken not from despair, but from the strange lightness of long-awaited justice. Marcus, Vanessa, and Brooke were held accountable, their arrogance stripped away in the face of the truth. For the first time in years, I walked out of a courtroom with my head high, carrying not shame or fear, but closure. Justice, though, was only part of the journey. Healing took longer. Nights when the silence pressed too hard. Mornings when I still expected Thomas's voice or Ryan's smile to greet me. But slowly, I began to rebuild. I realized my pain could either remain a wound or become a seed, and I chose the latter. With the support of neighbors and new friends, I started a small community project, an outreach group for seniors and widows navigating grief and finances. We meet at the library, share stories over coffee, and walk through the steps of protecting ourselves from manipulation. Each meeting reminds me that I am not alone, and neither are they. Out of betrayal, something stronger has grown, a space of trust, resilience, and hope. This chapter of my life will always carry scars, but those scars no longer define me. They remind me that survival can bloom into strength, and strength can reach outward to lift others. If my story touched you, I ask you to like, share, and comment. Not just for me, but so others know they, too, have a voice and the power to fight back. When the trial turned its gaze toward Vanessa, I thought I already knew the extent of her cruelty. But then the past came spilling out, stories of others she had deceived, finances she had drained, families she had fractured. This wasn't a single act of malice toward me. It was a pattern, stretching back years, a trail of manipulation left behind, like scars across other lives. Hearing it in court was like watching a mask shatter. She hadn't just stumbled into betrayal, she had perfected it. And for the first time, I understood I wasn't foolish for being caught in her web. She had made a life out of weaving them. That realization brought me both sorrow and a strange kind of peace. The sentencing came swiftly after the evidence and testimony. I sat there, heart steady, as the judge pronounced her fate. Vanessa would face the consequences she had evaded for far too long. In that moment, justice didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a door finally closing. As I left the courtroom, I carried no triumph, only a quiet certainty. What had been taken from me could never be replaced, but the cycle she lived in had ended here. If my story resonates with you, please like, share, and comment. Your voice matters more than you know, and together, we can shine light on truths too many are forced to carry alone. Looking back on everything, I see a journey I never asked for, but one that reshaped me. Betrayal from my own family cut deeper than I thought I could survive. And the financial abuse nearly stole not just my security, but my sense of worth. Yet through fear, heartbreak, and the fight for justice, I found something I didn't know I had: strength that was mine all along. I've learned how easy it is to ignore red flags when grief clouds your eyes. I've learned that trust, while precious, must be guarded with wisdom. And most of all, I've learned that silence only protects those who harm us. Speaking out, even when your voice shakes, is the first step to taking your life back. To anyone listening who has ever doubted their instincts or felt powerless, I want you to know you are not alone. Support exists, healing is possible, and your story, like mine, can carry weight and bring change. If my journey resonates with you, I invite you to join me in keeping this conversation alive. Like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences. Together, we can create a space where voices are heard, lessons are shared, and no one has to walk through betrayal in silence again.